France is a country which almost has it all. Delicious food, groundbreaking artists, and a big old bunch of nukes. France boasts the bustling metropolis of Paris, the sun-soaked beaches and deep blue seas of the Côte d'Azur, and the stunning scenery and world-class ski resorts of the French Alps. They've even got the greatest country to have ever existed right on their doorstep, connected to them via the Channel Tunnel. It's no wonder they're so bloody arrogant. She's wielding that baguette like a baseball bat, isn't she? But if there's one thing that the French don't have, aside from deodorant, it is local football rivalries. A stalwart of most countries' footballing scenes, especially in Europe, some of the most heated and competitive rivalries in the world are intra-city derbies. Milan has the Derby della Madonnina between AC Milan and Inter Milan. Buenos Aires has the Super Classico between Boca Juniors and River Plate. And Istanbul has the infamous trifecta of bitter resentment among their big three, Besiktas, Fenerbahce and Galatasaray. In England, the likes of Liverpool, Manchester and various London clubs contest some of the world's most watched rivalries. In Portugal, the Derby de Lisboa between Sporting and Benfica routinely stops an entire nation in its tracks. And in Scotland, the old firm between Glasgow Giants, Celtic and Rangers is a rivalry arguably without peer anywhere else in the world. Even in the United States, a much larger and less densely populated nation than France, with a far less deeply entrenched football culture, Major League Soccer still boasts two crosstown rivalries in the country's two largest cities, New York and Los Angeles. The same cannot be said for France. Two-time World Cup winners, ranked second in the world, and home to both the reigning European champions and one of Europe's Big Five leagues, which doesn't have a single major city rivalry, of any description, and hasn't done for almost 100 years. In fact, following Paris FC's promotion from Ligue 2 last season, this is the first time since the 1989-90 season, over 35 years ago, that there has even been two teams from the same city competing in Ligue 1. PSG and Racing Paris were the two Paris clubs who briefly coexisted in the top flight during the late 1980s, before Racing drowned under the weight of unsustainable debts and losses and were relegated to the local amateur leagues. Prior to that, you've got to go back to the 1978-79 and 1972-73 seasons, then followed by the mid-1960s, before PSG were even founded, to find two Parisian clubs competing in Ligue 1 at the same time. And even then, they were two clubs from the suburbs, Racing and Stade Francais, actually outside of Paris's strictly defined city walls. The last time that there were two teams from the same city that wasn't Paris competing in France's top flight was the 1938-39 season, on the eve of World War II, some 87 years ago, when Olympique Lillois and SC Fives shared a place in France's 16-team Division 1 for the last time, before merging to form Lille. Outside of Paris then, France just doesn't have any two-team cities. The second best team in Marseille, a city with a population of 900,000 people, a metropolitan area of 1.8 million, and a higher population than Turin, Seville or Liverpool, which is the second largest city in France behind Paris, competes in the amateur sixth tier of French football. Their 3,500 capacity stadium is rarely filled, and I can virtually guarantee that you have never heard of them. They're called Union Sportive Marseille Undum Catalan. The biggest derby in French football is Le Classique between Marseille and PSG, who are further apart than Paris and Milan, Paris and Dortmund, or Paris and Sheffield. France is practically unique, certainly in terms of major footballing nations in this regard. But why? Well, it's funny that you should ask, because that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to the land of Descartes, Napoleon, and Anelka, as we take a look at why French football is almost entirely devoid of two-team cities and local rivalries, whether that will ever change, and why, as with so many things, you can in large part blame the Nazis. I'm not saying that it's the worst thing they ever did, that would be for historians to determine, but you can add it to the list. We think of France as being one of the world's great football nations, because it is, but that wasn't always the case. The French were relatively late and fairly reluctant adopters of football, which has had many long-term ramifications. Paris and its suburbs may be the greatest talent-producing region in all of world football these days, but in the late 1800s, the French treated football with a great deal of suspicion. Whereas in Britain, where modern football was first codified, football rapidly spread from private schools and elite universities out into northern industrial towns, becoming known as the working man's game and establishing an audience, which consisted primarily of the proletariat, as would come to be the case in almost all countries. That wasn't so in France. Cycling, athletics, tennis and rugby union were France's mass participation sports, with football widely perceived as being the preserve of an aristocratic or moneyed class of metropolitan elites, as it was introduced to France by wealthy British expatriates residing in Paris. Rugby union, incidentally, which is strongly associated with the middle and upper classes in the United Kingdom, had almost the inverse reputation in France, where it became especially popular in the southwest of the country, often in rural and less affluent communities. This remains the case, albeit to a lesser extent to this day, and rugby union is currently enjoying a major popularity boom in France, at least in part due to people feeling disillusioned and disenchanted with football. It is difficult to overstate the extent to which the early era of French football was just British people playing football in France. Not specifically those guys, though, it should be said. The first French football club was founded in 1863, making it arguably the first association football club founded outside of Britain, but it was French in name only. In fact, France's first football clubs weren't even French in name, they had English names, like Standard Athletic Club and the White Rovers, because they were founded by Englishmen. France's first genuinely French club was founded almost 30 years later, in 1890, and they were literally called Club Français so as to distinguish themselves and their Frenchness from all of the British teams on the Paris football scene. AS Strasbourg sometimes stake a claim to be France's oldest club, since one of the clubs that they were formed through a merger of in 1920 was also founded in 1890, but even then, Strasbourg was a German city, and FV Strasbourg were a German club, as opposed to a French one at the time. Standard Athletic Club, which was a British social club in Paris, and indeed still is, won 4 out of the first 5 French football championships, which was twice as many as PSG had won until the Qataris arrived in 2011, and at the Dubonnet Cup, which was an invitational tournament and the precursor to the Coupe de France, intended to increase French interest in football, there was so little appetite for the sport among the natives that they had to invite English clubs. Swindon Town, Clapton Orient and Fulham were the 3 Dubonnet Cup winners, defeating Barnsley, Millwall and Queen's Park Rangers in the 3 finals of the short-lived competition. I am very pleased to see that it still takes pride of place on Clapton Orient, now Leyton Orient's list, of honours on their Wikipedia page. Hey, why not? Of course, football is now the most popular sport in France, in terms of both viewing figures, attendances and registered players, but it wasn't all plain sailing to get to that point. France only adopted professionalism in 1932, and even that would be short-lived. An impressive showing by an excellent France team at the 1958 World Cup in Sweden wasn't capitalised upon by either the French Football Federation or the LFP, at a time when Stade de Rome also reached 2 out of the first 4 European Cup finals, losing both against Real Madrid, and a slump for France's national team, an overall football scene followed. Whilst France's rugby team won the 5 Nations, now the 6 Nations 5 times during the 1960s, their football team failed to qualify for the 1962 World Cup, they went out in the group stage having failed to win a single game in 1966, and then failed to qualify again for both the 1970 and the 1974 World Cups. By the 1978 World Cup, where France went out in the group stage yet again, they hadn't won a single game at a World Cup since reaching the semi-finals 20 years ago. It wasn't until the 1980s, remarkably recent when you think that football has been the most popular sport in several countries for over 100 years, that French football enjoyed a major surge in popularity, inspired by an outstanding national team for the first time since the 50s, and the exploits of 3-time Ballon d'Or winner, in 3 successive years, Michel Platini. Les Bleus lifted the Euros in 1984, their first ever major tournament, having not even qualified since 1960, as well as reaching the semi-finals of the 1982 and 1986 World Cups. This time, unlike in the 50s, their success would be capitalised upon. This is an advert brought to you by me. A lot of people stop me in the street and say, "Wow, it's Alfie Potsama. You're the best football YouTuber in the world, and somehow even more handsome in real life than online. Please may I have your autograph, take a photo, and sleep with you?" And I have to say, look, I'm very sorry, that is awfully kind of you, but I do have a girlfriend. The other thing that they often say, I mean, almost always really, is there any way that I can get more of you? Is there perhaps a second channel of yours that I could subscribe to where you make to-camera documentaries about various interesting topics? And I say, yes, it's called the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, and funnily enough, I just uploaded my latest video there about the Basque derby between Real Sociedad and Athletic Club, the history of Basque sport and culture, and why that game is so unique among major football rivalries. I know, it sounds fascinating, and it is, which is why I am advertising it to you now. No payments were made in exchange for this advert. HITC Sevens and Alfie Potsama are the same person. T's and C's apply. Now back to the video. In the late 80s and early 90s, French clubs began consistently signing top European players for the first time. Monaco attracted the likes of Glenn Hoddle, George Weah, and Jurgen Klinsmann. Marseille welcomed Chris Waddle, Dragan Stojkovic, and Rudi Voller. And PSG brought in Brazilians like Ray, Leonardo, and, a little bit later, Ronaldinho. Marseille won the newly rebranded Champions League in 1993, defeating Fabio Capello's AC Milan in the final, and football status as France's most popular sport was cemented in 1998 when France won their first World Cup on home soil, with a generational squad boasting the likes of Lilian Thuram, Laurent Blanc, Marcel Desailly, Patrick Vieira, Didier Deschamps, David Trezeguet, Thierry Henry, and their talisman Zinedine Zidane, who would go on to rival Michel Platini as the greatest French footballer of all time. Even then, though, there were setbacks. Marseille's Champions League, the only time that a French club had been crowned as European champions until PSG last season, was immediately followed by them being found guilty of bribery and attempted match fixing, which saw them stripped of their Ligue 1 title, administratively relegated to Ligue 2, and their president jailed. France's national team, meanwhile, despite having gone on a virtually uninterrupted run of producing immense talent since 1998, crashed out of both the 2002 and the 2010 World Cups in the group stage, along with Euro 2008, finding a real knack for scandals, training ground bust-ups and spectacular meltdowns, alienating much of the French public in the process. As a result of that complex history and all of those factors, France's football culture remains very distinct from neighbouring countries like England, Germany and Spain. Whether the French are less passionate about football as a whole, owing to the sport's slow start and choppy past there, is difficult to measure and is subject to some debate, but what is certain is that there is much less of a match-going culture. Whereas over 20 million people attended live matches in Italy and Spain in the 2023-24 season, according to data gathered by Transfermarkt, over 30 million in Germany, and over 44 million in England, only 14.9 million people attended games in France. That's despite the fact that Germany is the only country out of those five which is larger than France. Football clubs require match-going fans, especially throughout the 20th century, before broadcast and commercial revenue became so significant, and France just didn't have very many of them. Whereas cities like Liverpool, Seville and Turin, mentioned earlier as all being smaller than Marseille, have enough match-going fans to sustain multiple clubs, and multiple big clubs, few cities in France could historically, and arguably still to this day. Then there is the sheer geography and demographics. Paris is an enormous metropolitan area, home to over 13 million people, or approximately 20% of France's population, but outside of that, France is fairly evenly and sparsely populated. France is over 4 times larger than England, for example, but only has 1.2 times the population. France just doesn't have that many major cities then, compared to its European peers. Marseille is the only city outside of Paris with a population in excess of 525,000, which is less than the population of Sheffield. Saint-Etienne, who are France's third most successful club, behind PSG and Marseille, is a city of just 172,000 people, making it smaller than Southend, and even its metro area, at 500,000 people, is smaller than either the Middlesbrough or Bournemouth Poole metro areas. Saint-Etienne is about the same size as Garden Grove in California, or Ludwigshafen in Rhineland-Palatinate, as additional context for any American or German viewers. Apologies to any non-UK, US, and German viewers. I'm afraid you're just going to have to get your HITC Sevens audience stats up if you want your own personalised population comparisons in the future. The 20th largest population centre in France is Villeurbanne, a commune in the Lyon metropolitan area, which doesn't even have a professional football club. The 20th largest population centre in England by comparison is Kingston upon Hull, a city of over 250,000 people, which is also the largest city in the wider East Riding of Yorkshire, which has a metro area population of over 600,000 people. Their football team competes in the Championship, and if you are a regular viewer of this channel, then you will know far more about them than you need to. Combine France's smaller cities with fewer match-going football fans, and the lack of multi-club cities starts to make sense, but it's a little bit more complex than that. French football has never been especially profitable. In fact, it would just be more accurate to say that it has never been profitable at all. Historically, low attendances and relatively weak appetite for the sport resulted in depressed gate receipts and broadcast revenue compared with France's European peers, none of which has actually changed, despite the increase in popularity from the 80s onwards, and most Ligue 1 clubs still struggle just to keep the lights on, with the DNCG constituting just about the most draconian football finance regulators on the continent. French clubs, therefore, were for many years reliant on subsidies and local government support. From the perspective of cities, councils, and local municipalities, it didn't make much sense to fund two or more local clubs to beef it out with each other. They would much rather focus all of their efforts and resources on one club in the hope of making them as strong and as popular as possible, in the hope of them organically growing their own revenue, and so that they are best able to represent the city and region on the national stage. On an even more fundamental level, of course, it is just cheaper to build one stadium and help fund one club than it is 2, 3, or 4, at least without significantly diluting that support to the point of it no longer being adequate. France also tends to have very strictly and tightly defined city walls, and sometimes city councils and municipalities will refuse to fund anything that falls outside of the city and outside of their jurisdiction. PSG, perhaps most notably, were formed through a merger of Paris FC and Stade Saint-Germain in 1970, and initially played their home games at the Stade Georges Lefebvre in the commune of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a little over 4 miles outside of Paris's strictly defined boundaries. In 1972, therefore, just a couple of years after they founded, the Council of Paris threatened to withdraw their support of PSG unless the club changed their name from Paris Saint-Germain to Paris FC, ridding themselves of their suburban Saint-Germain roots, and relocated to a stadium inside of Paris's city walls. PSG refused, which led to Paris FC demerging and refounding independently, taking PSG's place in the first division, and PSG being relegated to the third division. PSG now play at the Parc des Princes, of course, and have done since sealing their top-flight return in 1974, and if you look closely at the dotted lines on this map, you can see that the Parc des Princes lies on the very edge of Paris' city boundaries, less than 50 feet from it to be precise, as does the Stade Jean Bouin, located just across the street from the Parc des Princes, which Paris FC just moved into ahead of their long-awaited return to Ligue 1. These are the more innocent reasons why French football doesn't have any intra-city rivalries. Now comes the time, as in all of my videos, where we have to talk about the Nazis, but on this occasion, actually for good reason. In 1940, German soldiers pumped full of crystal meth successfully invaded and occupied France in about 6 weeks. The Nazis occupied the north and part of the west of France, while installing a collaborationist government to administer a so-called free zone in the south of the country as a puppet state, known as Vichy France. We haven't the time to get into all of the details on this occasion, but as the history buffs among you will know, they were highly problematic, very anti-Semitic, very Russophobic, and very Anglophobic, which, if you ask me, has to be the worst type of racism. Vichy France also had some rather unusual ideas about football. Almost on day one, they mandated that all footballers must have second jobs, effectively abolishing professionalism, which had only been introduced in 1932, in a move that was formalised with a hard limit on the number of, by that stage, only quasi-professionals that a team could even name in their squad. The Vichy regime's motive was to promote participation, not just in football but in all sports, many of which they amateurised, in an effort to improve athleticism and physical health. There is very little evidence to suggest that the de facto ban on professionalism had the desired impact, but it was successful in setting French football back decades. Now, some would say that was a failure, wouldn't they? But then again, it's easy to cast aspersions about Nazi collaborators, isn't it? Easy and both morally and just factually correct. That's Pierre Laval, by the way, who was the leader of Vichy France, and therefore a Nazi collaborator, which is odd because, looks Indian, doesn't he? Anyway, moving on. The Vichy regime also changed the length of matches from 90 to 80 minutes. Again, didn't catch on for some reason, as well as abolishing all transfers because they were communist or trans or Jewish or something. I lose track, to be honest. Sometimes the justifications will be bogus.
Sometimes the complaints will be false. Okay? Good.
The Vichy regime also played a key role in the decimation of two-team cities and city rivalries. Despite all of the obstacles outlined in this video, and frequently cited as being the major reasons why the geography of French football differs from its neighbouring countries, pre-Vichy and pre-World War II, France did have several two-team cities. In the earliest days of the French National Championship, which operated as a knockout competition, all of the clubs were based in Paris. This had diversified by the start of the 1930s, which was the beginning of the professional era and a nationwide league, split into two groups from the 1932-33 season onwards, but there were still 4 Paris clubs among France's 20-team top flight. In the 1937-38 season, shortly before the outbreak of World War II and France's Nazi occupation, there were 16 teams representing 13 cities in France's Division 1, with Paris, Lille and Roubaix, a city of just 100,000 people, all having 2 top-flight teams. This would never happen again post-World War II. Vichy's attack on professionalism, for a start, drove several clubs out of business, immediately reducing the overall number of clubs, and the number of multi-club cities and city rivalries by extension. Clubs who were deemed to have ties to socialist and union movements, or any foreign or Jewish associations, also face repression or forced dissolution and mergers, further depleting the total stock of clubs. The greatest blow came in 1943, though, just a year before France was liberated by the Allies, when the Vichy regime fully reorganised French football, replacing clubs with federal and regional organisations with just one representative team. Overnight, the top flight of French football went from looking like this to this. Not just cities, but each region was reduced to just one representative team, the sole exception being the Île-de-France region, which is by far the largest of France's 18 regions, which was represented by 2 teams, one for the city of Paris, called EF Paris Capitale, and one for the city's suburbs and the wider Île-de-France region, called EF Paris Île-de-France. This reorganisation was of course short-lived, in the sense that it formally only lasted for a single season, due to Germany's defeat in World War II and the puppet Vichy regime falling in August 1944, but the impacts of it can still be felt over 80 years on. Football had been dealt a massive blow by amateurism and brainless Vichy reforms, and it wasn't as easy as simply waving a magic wand and reforming all of the pre-Vichy clubs as they were pre-war. Infrastructure had been damaged or repurposed, administrators had moved or been killed, and many players had either given up on football because Vichy amateurism meant that it was no longer a viable career option, or had also been killed. Professionalism returned post-war under President Charles de Gaulle, but with scarce public resources, this was the beginning of cities and municipalities refusing to fund more than one club, making the return of multi-club cities and city rivalries practically an impossibility. France's first post-war champions, Following the return of professionalism were Lille, who had been formed by a basically forced merger of former city rivals Olympique Lillois and SC Sevens in 1944. Post-war, there was no effort or appetite to revive the two individual clubs, and so Lille became the city's only professional club. Had it not been for the Nazi occupation of France and the imposition of the Vichy regime, in all likelihood, whilst France's geography and football culture would still provide constraints compared to countries like England or Germany, cities like Lille would almost certainly still have two competitive clubs. Instead, whilst France has a near total dearth of city rivalries, it is blessed with some notorious regional derbies. Lille, for example, contests one of France's most bitter rivalries, the Derby du Nord against Lens. It's not quite the Etihad to Old Trafford, Anfield to Bramley Moor Dock, or Stamford Bridge to Craven Cottage, but the two teams are less than 20 miles apart as the crow flies. Formerly intensified by socio-economic and political differences, with Lens considered a more industrial and working-class city versus the more middle-class and cosmopolitan Lille, that aspect has been watered down in the modern era, but the two teams are still among the closest to each other geographically of any two teams that regularly compete in Ligue 1. There is a similar class dynamic to the rivalry between Lyon and Saint-Etienne, sometimes referred to simply as Le Derby, with Lyon traditionally considered to be more affluent and Saint-Etienne more industrial and working class. Again, a lot of these dynamics have been diluted by deindustrialization, but the two cities are only about an hour apart, both clubs have dominated French football in different eras, and both are among the best supported and most loyally followed clubs in France. Unfortunately, Saint-Etienne were relegated last season, putting Le Derby temporarily on hold, but they have averaged over 33,000 fans at their home games in Ligue 2 this season, which is more than all but 5 Ligue 1 teams. The two closest teams in France's top flight, before Paris FC's promotion under the wealthiest private ownership group in world football last season, was AS Monaco and OGC Nice, who compete in the Derby de la Côte d'Azur. Though Monaco is a sovereign state, which isn't part of France at all, it is barely 11 miles from Nice's Allianz Riviera to Monaco's Stade Louis II as the crow flies, and the two cities are so close together that I once ended up in Monaco by accident after I missed my stop on a train from Nice. Unfortunately, despite Monaco dominating the rivalry in terms of results, the fact that they have so few fans and are situated in a tiny tax haven full of pensioners means that the Derby de la Côte d'Azur lacks the fire and intensity of France's biggest rivalries. Other regional rivalries include the Derby course between Ajaccio and Bastia on the French island of Corsica, the Derby du Languedoc between Montpellier and Nîmes Olympique, the Derby de la Lorraine between Metz and Nancy, and the Derby Breton, which is sometimes used to refer to any game between Brittany's 5 strongest clubs, but is most notably the rivalry between Nantes and Rennes. These rivalries are intensified, if anything, by the total absence of city rivalries, which show little sign of re-emerging in French football after a century in the wilderness, at least anytime soon. The sole exception is in Paris, the only true two-team city in the whole of France. Right now, despite their acrimonious split in the early 70s, just 2 years after PSG were founded, there is little animosity, certainly from PSG fans towards Paris FC, since the two teams last met in a competitive fixture all the way back in 1978, with most PSG fans that I've encountered broadly supportive actually of Paris FC, not yet viewing them as any kind of threat, and joking that they could instead leapfrog their actual rivals Marseille. Paris FC are no joke though. They are immensely rich, they have very capable operators behind them, and a long-term strategy which is already ahead of schedule. They have won 3 and lost 3 of their first 7 games this season, competing in Ligue 1 for the first time in almost 50 years. There is every chance, in the long run, that Paris FC could become PSG's greatest competitors in French football, or at least one of them, in which case, France's first genuine post-war top-flight city rivalry would become inevitable. Paris is the largest metropolitan area in the European Union, and by far the richest in terms of overall GDP. It's only slightly smaller than the London metropolitan area, but whereas London is home to 7 Premier League clubs, 3 Championship clubs, and 17 professional football clubs in total, including 3 out of the 10 richest clubs in world football, this is the first time in over 3 decades that Paris has had just 2 Ligue 1 clubs. Even accounting for differences in terms of match-going culture and history, Paris and the wider Ile-de-France region should comfortably be able to sustain multiple competitive clubs. I have made an entire video about the Red Bull-backed LVMH project at Paris FC, titled How Europe's New Richest Club Plan to Rival PSG, should any of you be interested. I found it quite interesting, but that is it for today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it. It is a not very often discussed quirk of the French game, and it allowed us to touch upon a lot of the weird, wonderful, and at times not so wonderful stories and tales of the history of French football as a whole, so, you know, what's not to like? I would like to issue a formal apology though for my deodorant joke at the beginning of this video. That was just some good old-fashioned Anglo-French banter. I have been to France a few times, and I have to say, personally, I didn't find it to be that smelly. Or at least not the people. Maybe the cheese. Interestingly, the stereotype about French people smelling bad or not washing also originated during World War II, spread by American GIs stationed in France, who encountered some rather smelly French people. Of course, France had been occupied for about 4 years, had a large rural population, and limited access to hot or cold running water, so I guess it isn't all that surprising that they perhaps weren't smelling their best at the time. They had more pressing issues, you could say. In a 1998 poll, only 47% of French respondents said that they showered or bathed daily, compared to 80% of Dutch and Danish people consulted, furthering the stereotype, but as of the 21st century, the French are Europe's total and per capita highest consumers of shower gels, shampoos, and, most crucially of all, deodorants. So my joke was just factually incorrect, and I apologise sincerely to any French people who may or may not have been offended. Hopefully you took it in good spirits, and it doesn't result in another 100 years war between us. Thank you all as ever for watching. Feel free to hit the like button if you found today's video to be remotely interesting or informative, and I really do mean even if only remotely. And why not consider subscribing to both the HITC Sevens and Alfie Potsama YouTube channels, the second best and the best channels on all of YouTube, some might say, both of which should be about to appear on your screens any minute now, along with a couple of videos, one from each channel, that you might enjoy watching after this. If I remember, one of them should be the Paris FC video that I mentioned only a moment ago. Meanwhile, the other is a brand new video of me at the Basque Derby, which is one of the most unique rivalries in world football. Both well worth a watch, of course. You can also find me on various social media platforms, typically via the username at HITC Sevens. And should you wish to support me additionally, you can now do so either via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel or, even better still, via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama, where you can become an official channel member. No OnlyFans yet though. Please stop asking. Thank you all for watching, I'll see you next time. Until then, please take care out there. I love you all. Cheers.